A stone church stands alone at the edge of a jungle town. Inside, 50 men are dying of hunger. Their uniforms have rotted off their bodies. Their boots are gone. Some of them can no longer stand without help. Outside, hundreds of armed men surround the walls, waiting. And then, one morning, someone slides a newspaper under the door. It says the war is over. It says their country lost. It says they can go home. The men inside read it and decide it's a lie. They will stay in that church, fighting, starving, and burying their own friends for almost a full year after the war that started this siege has already ended. Not because they're fanatics, not because they don't want to survive, but because every single time someone tells them the truth, it sounds exactly like a trick designed to make them open the door and die. This is the story of the last soldiers of a dying empire, men who held a broken church longer than most armies hold entire cities against an enemy who didn't even want to kill them anymore. It's a story about courage, but it's also a story about what happens when the fog of war becomes so thick that even the truth can't get through it. By 1898, the Spanish Empire was collapsing. For nearly 400 years, Spain had ruled the Philippines, a chain of islands on the other side of the planet, thousands of miles from Madrid. But by the late 1800s, that grip was slipping fast. Filipino revolutionaries wanted independence. Spain wanted to hold on. And thousands of miles away, a new player was entering the picture, the United States, fresh off a declaration of war against Spain over Cuba. That war, the Spanish-American War, would only last a few months, but it would end an empire. In the small remote town of Baler, on the eastern coast of Luzon Island, a tiny Spanish garrison had no idea any of this was happening. Baler wasn't a strategic prize, it wasn't full of resources or wealth. It was chosen for one reason only. It was so isolated that reinforcements could take weeks to arrive by sea. That isolation would soon become the whole story. In 1898, a detachment of Spanish soldiers, the number usually given is around 50 men, led by 2 officers, was sent to hold the town. Their orders were simple: keep order, protect Spanish interests, and wait. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to become trapped in one of the strangest sieges in military history, a fight that would outlast the war it was part of. The garrison digs. In the Spanish detachment in Baler was led by Captain Enrique de las Morenas, with a younger officer, Lieutenant Saturnino Martín Cerezo, as his second in command. Around 50 soldiers made up the rest of the garrison, a mix of Spanish regulars and colonial troops, far from any real base of support. When Filipino revolutionary forces began surrounding the town in the summer of 1898, the Spanish soldiers made a decision that would define the next 11 months of their lives. Instead of trying to hold the whole town or attempting a risky retreat through hostile jungle, they pulled back into the strongest building available, the Church of San Luis Obispo, a solid stone structure with thick walls and a commanding position over the surrounding area. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even particularly comfortable, but it was defensible. Stone doesn't burn easily, doesn't fall to a single volley, and gives defenders exactly what every siege commander wants: time. Outside those walls, Filipino revolutionary fighters and later regular Filipino forces tightened their positions. They had numbers, they had knowledge of the terrain, and crucially, they had a cause that most of the local population supported: independence from centuries of colonial rule. Inside, the Spanish soldiers had none of that. They had ammunition, discipline, a defensible position, and almost no idea what was actually happening in the wider war. Cut off from the world. This is the detail that makes the siege of Baler so unusual. Most sieges in history are fought by soldiers who at least know why they're fighting and how the war around them is going. The men in Baler had neither. Communication with the outside world was almost non-existent. No telegraph line ran to the town. No regular supply ships could easily reach it once the siege tightened. Whatever news reached the defenders came filtered through messengers, rumors, and documents delivered by the very people besieging them. which from inside a locked church under fire is not exactly a source you can trust. And there was a lot they didn't know. They didn't know that the war between Spain and the United States would be short and one-sided. They didn't know that a peace treaty would be signed within months. They didn't know that back in Madrid, the government that sent them to Baler no longer had any real claim to the Philippines at all. All they knew was what they could see through gun slits cut into stone walls, armed men outside, and orders from a commander who believed their duty was to hold the position until properly relieved. Life inside the siege. Living inside a besieged church for months at a time is not the stuff of glamorous war stories. It's slow, grinding, and brutal in ways that don't always involve gunfire. Food ran short almost immediately. The defenders had grain, some livestock, and whatever they could scavenge, but nothing close to a real supply chain. Rationing became a daily discipline, then a daily desperation. Disease hit harder than bullets. Cooped up in cramped, damp conditions with poor nutrition, the soldiers began suffering from beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin deficiency that causes swelling, nerve damage, heart failure, and in severe cases, death. It's a slow, miserable way to die, and it began claiming lives inside the church long before any final battle would. Captain de las Morenas, the garrison's senior commander, was among those who fell seriously ill. As his condition worsened, command increasingly passed to his younger second-in-command, Lieutenant Martín Cerezo, a man whose stubborn insistence on following orders to the letter would come to define the entire siege. Outside, the besieging forces launched attacks, sniped at the walls, and tried repeatedly to force a surrender. Inside, the defenders fought back with volleys through window slits, patched the walls after each assault, and buried their dead in whatever space they could find, sometimes inside the church itself, because there was nowhere else safe to bury them. There was no field hospital, no proper medicine, and no way to treat the wounded beyond whatever basic care the surviving soldiers could improvise for each other. Every man who fell sick became both a patient and a burden on a garrison that could barely spare the food, let alone the manpower, to care for him. And yet, accounts from survivors describe something unexpected growing inside those walls. Not despair, but a strange, hardened camaraderie. Men who had never met before the siege began sharing rations, standing each other's watches, and covering for comrades too weak to hold a rifle steady. Discipline didn't collapse under the pressure. If anything, it tightened, because discipline was the only structure keeping 50 frightened, starving men from turning on each other. The besieging forces, for their part, weren't simply trying to kill everyone inside. Many of the Filipino commanders surrounding Baler recognized early on that this small garrison posed no real threat to the broader war for independence. Baler wasn't a strategic prize worth burning to the ground. It was a stubborn thorn, and the preferred solution was to starve it into submission rather than storm it and lose fighters on both sides for a building that ultimately didn't matter. That decision, to besiege rather than annihilate, is part of the reason the standoff stretched on for so long. Neither side was in a hurry that would force a violent conclusion. Time, ironically, became the defenders' greatest enemy and their most reliable ally at once. The war ends, and nobody believes it. By December 1898, the war that had started this entire siege was already over. Spain and the United States had signed the Treaty of Paris. Under its terms, Spain gave up the Philippines entirely. The empire that sent these soldiers to Baler no longer had any claim to the land they were dying to defend. Word of this eventually reached the men outside the church, and in an act that says a lot about the era's strange mixture of chivalry and warfare, the besieging Filipino forces tried to tell the Spanish defenders the truth. They sent messages, they sent newspapers, they even brought a Spanish priest, and at different points, former Spanish officers to try to convince the garrison that the war was over and further resistance was pointless. Each time, the defenders inside the Church reached the same conclusion. This had to be a trick. It's worth pausing on why that conclusion made sense to them at the time. They had been besieged for months by people actively trying to kill them. Every previous attempt at communication from outside had come wrapped in demands to surrender. From inside those walls, a newspaper announcing Spain's total defeat looked exactly like something an enemy would fabricate to get them to open the doors. Documents could be forged, priests could be coerced, officers could be impersonators, or worse, could have switched sides under pressure. So the defenders did something that, from the outside, looks almost irrational, and from the inside, looks like extreme discipline taken to its logical extreme. They refused to believe the war was over until it could be proven to them by a source they considered impossible to fake. That standard would turn out to be very, very high. Part of what made the defenders so suspicious was a betrayal that had already happened once before, involving one of their own. Early in the siege, a Spanish officer who had been trusted by the garrison ended up on the other side, either through capture, persuasion, or defection. The details are murky, and different accounts describe it differently. But the effect on the men still holding the church was the same either way. It proved to them that a familiar, trusted uniform did not automatically mean a trustworthy message. If one of their own could switch sides or be forced to say things under pressure, then anyone claiming to bring news from the outside world had to be treated as a potential enemy, no matter how convincing they sounded. This is the psychological trap that defines the entire second half of the siege. The defenders weren't simply stubborn, they had built out of necessity an almost unbreakable filter against outside information, because trusting the wrong message even once could mean opening the doors to men who would kill them. The problem is that a filter strong enough to block every lie is also strong enough to block the truth. And for months, that's exactly what happened. The breaking point. As the months dragged into 1899, conditions inside the church went from bad to catastrophic. Captain de las Morenas succumbed to Beriberi and died, leaving Lieutenant Martín Cerezo in full command of a shrinking, sickening garrison. Of the roughly 50 men who had originally taken shelter in the church, more than a dozen were now dead, not from bullets, but from disease and starvation. The living were barely holding together. Uniforms had rotted apart in the tropical humidity. Boots had fallen apart months earlier. Some soldiers were too weak from illness to stand a full watch. And still, the siege continued because in Martín Cerezo's mind, no verified order to stand down had ever arrived. This is the part of the story that turns from tragic to almost unbelievable. The defenders weren't holding out because they thought they could win a war that no longer existed. They were holding out because their entire military identity was built around one unbreakable principle. A soldier does not abandon his post without a legitimate order to do so, and every attempt to deliver that order had come from a source they had every reason to distrust. Multiple attempts were made to end the standoff peacefully. Spanish officials, real ones, sent specifically for this purpose, traveled to Baler to convince the garrison the war was over. Some of these men were viewed with suspicion simply because they arrived escorted by Filipino forces, which, in the defenders' minds, meant they could be speaking under duress. Each rejected appeal added more time to a siege that had already outlasted the war that caused it by months. The final proof, eventually something happened that the defenders inside the church could no longer explain away as enemy trickery. A group of Spanish officers, including someone the garrison's own men could personally vouch for, someone whose loyalty and identity were beyond doubt, arrived with definitive, verifiable proof. Official documentation, newspapers from Spain itself, and first-hand testimony that could not have been fabricated by the besieging forces. This time, the wall of disbelief finally cracked. Lieutenant Martín Cerezo, now leading a garrison reduced to roughly 30 exhausted, sick, starving survivors, accepted that the war truly was over, that Spain no longer held the Philippines, that the empire they had been defending for nearly a year no longer existed on this side of the world, and that further resistance served no purpose at all. On June 2nd, 1899, 337 days after the siege began, the surviving defenders of Baler walked out of the church they had turned into their fortress, their prison, and for some of their comrades, their grave. They didn't surrender in disgrace. They surrendered on their own terms, with their weapons, and with something remarkable: the deep respect of the very forces that had besieged them for nearly a year. Filipino commanders, impressed by the sheer stubbornness and discipline of the defense, allowed the surviving Spanish soldiers to leave with military honors, a mark of respect rarely extended after a siege that long and that bitter. When the survivors of Baler finally returned to Spain, they weren't treated as an embarrassing footnote to a lost war. They were treated as heroes. Spain, in 1899, was a country reeling from total defeat. It had lost the last major pieces of its once massive overseas empire, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In the span of a single year, the nation needed something to hold on to, some proof that Spanish soldiers hadn't simply collapsed the moment real pressure was applied. The defenders of Baler became that proof. They were nicknamed Los Últimos de Filipinas, the last of the Philippines, and their story spread through Spanish newspapers, then Spanish memory, then Spanish popular culture, inspiring plays, films, and books for generations afterward. Lieutenant Martín Cerezo, the man who had held command through the worst of it, was celebrated for his leadership and discipline. He later published his own account of the siege, helping cement the story in Spanish national memory as a symbol of loyalty and endurance in the face of total isolation. For the Philippines, the siege was a strange, almost symbolic footnote to a much larger story: the end of Spanish colonial rule, the brief and complicated period of Filipino independence that followed, and the beginning of American control that would replace one foreign power with another. The soldiers besieging that church weren't fighting to keep Spain out of a war that mattered to them personally. They were fighting for their own country's future, a future that ironically would take decades longer to fully arrive. In the decades that followed, the story of Baler took on a life of its own. It was retold in Spanish school books as an example of duty and endurance. It was adapted into films more than once, most notably in the mid-20th century and again in a more recent retelling that introduced the story to a new generation of viewers. The church itself became something of a pilgrimage site, a physical reminder that an ordinary building under the right circumstances can become the last stand of an empire's final chapter in a place it once ruled for centuries. What's easy to miss in the more romanticized versions of this story is how ordinary the men inside that church actually were. They weren't legendary warriors or elite soldiers handpicked for an impossible mission. They were a routine garrison sent to a forgettable posting who found themselves trapped by circumstances entirely outside their control. Their endurance wasn't built on extraordinary training or unmatched skill. It was built on the same things that keep any group of people together under pressure: shared hardship, mutual reliance, and a chain of command that, however isolated from the truth, never fully broke down. The Siege of Baler isn't really a story about a battle. Almost no dramatic fighting happened in its final months. It's a story about what happens when soldiers become so committed to their duty and so cut off from the truth that they can no longer tell the difference between an enemy's trick and their own country's surrender. The defenders of that church weren't stupid, and they weren't fanatics. Every decision they made was logical, given what they could see and what they had every reason to doubt. That's what makes their story so unsettling and so human. In war, The fog isn't always smoke and confusion on a battlefield. Sometimes it's simply not knowing who to believe and paying for that uncertainty in months in disease in the lives of your friends, 337 days after they locked themselves inside a stone church to defend an empire. That empire no longer even existed on paper. And still, they held the line, not out of hatred for the enemy outside, but out of loyalty to an order that had already stopped meaning anything, delivered by a country that had already stopped listening. Maybe that's the real lesson of Baler. Sometimes the hardest battle isn't the one fought with rifles through a church window. It's the one fought inside your own head, deciding whether the truth in front of you is real or just the enemy's cleverest weapon yet.